The fifth. The fifth man wore red ceremonial robes. Torun noticed his movement lacked the certainty she had seen in his predecessors. His face was gentle, but in his eyes she felt she could see a sorrow that undermined what confidence he held. He spoke. I too lived at a turning point in the thought of man. I was the last of an era and the first of an era. I oversaw the transference of our old line into an institution that alongside another for more than 1,000 years came to dominate man's understanding of existence. The institution was a regression, a corruption of the message of an earlier incarnation of yourself, and I, through my weakness, succumbed to it. I had been blessed enough to discover the ways of my predecessors, and those ways had won me, but your father foresaw the dominance of the institution that I later joined. He knew his influence would be further forgotten, even destroyed, unless he acted. So he gave me a degree of weakness. He used me as an ignorant vessel by which to carry our influence forward. Your earlier incarnation was sent in response to a great conquest. A man had risen who consolidated unprecedented power. His presence was felt across the known world. Your father had seen his strength, arranged that he would be given a kernel of wisdom to ally his power with understanding. But the man had a strong and savage thirst, and it lost him the love of friends who then conspired against him. In his wake, chaos ensued. Those who had previously followed now fought for the remains, and all of the power he held then fell, divided into the hands of others. If the man had lived, perhaps his wisdom would have come to rule. Instead, the void that came threatened the destruction of all the understanding your father's first son established. Another power rose, one that sought to emulate the consolidation that had been lost in the chaos. Conquest again consumed the known world, but this power would rule with little regard for subtle understanding. It was single-minded in its pursuit of power, and the order it instituted was not one defined by wisdom. Rather, it was designed merely to protect the power it had won. It was at this time your father gave his second son. He was sent with a message of humility and self-denial, a message of principles that, if followed, promised the achievement of grace. His timing was to directly counter the jealous hoarding the new power epitomized. But though your forebear developed a following that grew to enormity, his gentle message was almost immediately co-opted and distorted by a man who saw an opening by which he himself could satisfy his own thirst for power and influence. That man was ambitious. He recognized the ease with which he could betray your forebear's peaceful message and use it to control man. It was to the force of his mind that my weakness was made to be susceptible. That man linked your forebear's gentle message to the power of control he sought to establish, and from that grew the institution that I joined. The tradition established thus became a vehicle for three main interests. I used it, largely unknowingly, as a vehicle for carrying forth the principles of reality as understood by myself and my predecessors. It was also used as a vehicle for the message of your forebear, largely misunderstood though it was, but it was most dramatically and powerfully used as a highly efficient system to control the masses towards the enrichment of those always driven to power. The power sought was not one inspired by wisdom and grace. Instead, it was a base power, power over thought, power over resources, a jealous power to mirror its corrupted founder. The man had found a vehicle that worked on the fallibility of man's mind as well as his body. By co-opting your forebear's tradition, that man, alongside others, became powerful, and together they marshaled the forces of fear in man while promising the key to eternal happiness. It was that key they offered that appealed to the weaknesses of both mind and body. They promised redemption by another, and all that was required was faithful belief. My reputation and abilities were of value to the institution. Perhaps I offered, through my background in your father's tradition, a degree of credibility others did not have. The institution was not one of intellectualism. It shunned individual thought, the true exploration of ideas. And so when they won me, they won a degree of credibility. But because the new institution was based in belief, and because its followers lived in a dominated state of ignorance and susceptibility, it was open to influence from my high place within. Unknowingly, I became both a subversive element and a vehicle for further corruption. As a subversive element, a part of me retained its allegiance to its early love for reason, for the old tradition of the free exploration of mind and matter that my predecessors had established, for which they had worked so hard with such diligence. I recognized the rising fall of reason. I sought to marry the new with the old, such that they could coexist. I hoped that those who retained the powers of the intellect within the new institution would carry forward those wise traditions that held prominence before. I was not without success. Because of the position I established, and because my work was of such magnitude that it could not be ignored, I influenced all that came after me within that new institution. I believed in the old tradition, but also in the truth of your forebears' message. I believed the new institution represented a vehicle for the widespread achievement of grace by man. What undermined that possibility was the nature of the institution's inherent preference for faith, even where in contradiction with established understanding. And it was in relation to that preference that I, ironically, most particularly served the corruption. I have told you in what way I was a subversive element. Now I shall speak of how I was also a vehicle for corruption. I was tortured by a self-realization that I had witnessed, and yet not adequately understood. It was that very realization that had led me from my predecessors into the arms of the institution. I had, as I said, been blessed to discover my predecessors' ways, and yet, with my weakness, I quickly learned my own shortcomings when I realized what a long path it was to God. It was too long, and so I sought a quicker path, and there I found the message of he who had founded the institution, he who had commandeered and corrupted the teachings of your forebear. In him I found confidence there was a shorter way. I, like all men, recognized to some extent my weakness. I saw it in myself, that same weakness that later led me to so strongly comprehend how few would pass through the harmonious gates. I was intimidated by the extent and breadth of the path that my predecessors had so bravely followed. It was a path that continued eternally. The corrupter, by contrast, had offered the earlier path. Although I had well understood the true path to understanding, I too was susceptible to ease, and to believe was easier than to know. Like any man, I was more easily led when faced with both immediate and threatened misery, and that is what man believed he faced in the event he did not allow himself to be led. Most were strong-armed with threats, but they were the relatively weak. I was not one of those. My weakness was in my mind, a mind that could see much, but which questioned itself and craved satisfaction. For me, it was not that I wanted for food on my table, nor did I fear the cutting edge of men's words. I could handle hunger and debates. What I could not handle was the sense I developed through my studies of my distance from God. Instead of driving me forward, as it had my predecessors, my understanding suffocated me with my own failings. In that context, I came to hate the arrogance of my predecessors. I hated that anyone would think that they could reach what I realized I was too weak to reach. Their confidence was, as my teacher told me, the sin of pride. I thus rejected my own colleagues with whom I now stand. I rejected the very people who had opened my mind in favor of those who had closed it. I trusted my new teachers because it was easier to do that than to hold true to what I more deeply knew. Thus I taught that man must obey authority, for that was my own justification. Indeed, it was the only justification for taking the path I did. Authority taught that I must have faith in authority, for I knew it was only through faith that I could possibly follow that which so obviously violated my own sense of reason. The traveler nodded slowly and then spoke. That earlier incarnation of whom you spoke was intended to undermine man's taste for war, to temper man's corrupt spirit through peace. You spoke of him as my forebear, but he was not, for he was born of a woman, whereas I was not. He is the forebear of my wife, and of others like her. He is their predecessor, not mine. You understood, but then failed to respect the hierarchy of universal being. Despite all your wisdom, all the intellect that made you capable of what you achieved, you were undermined because you lost this one single point. And that loss eventually caused your very strengths to crumble, and yet you are here. You are here because it was your weakness that allowed the successful completion of your task. Because of you, a way of thought continued where it would otherwise have been extinguished. But you existed on the back of corruption, and worked to comprehend the truth through that distorted lens. Even your own teaching became confused to contradiction, but it was not surprising. The memory of my wife's forebear was confused with stories steeped in nonsense, stories created to make sense out of confused foundations. The corrupter, that founder of the institution, was in fact a conduit of darkness, set in place to confuse and undermine. It was his task to unknowingly plant the seeds for another power, which would rise to be his masters. My wife's forebear had worked to break the course of a tradition of war by setting in place an option for peace, but the injection of my father's power inevitably caused waves to ripple through mankind. A single touch of his finger into a lower world is like to a man's touch upon the surface of water. The touch displaces, the water clings, and the result is inevitable disturbance. This can be a small price to pay, but it must be done carefully, for evolved life is delicate, like a fine web that can be broken. The traveler stopped speaking. Torin had listened intently, at hearing herself referenced in relation to her forebear. She had wondered why he had not appeared, but he was of a different nature from these men, of a different line, to serve a different purpose, alone. The man that stood before her had listened to the traveler, but now spoke again in the traveler's momentary silence. You said I failed to properly comprehend the hierarchy of being. Perhaps I still do. Please tell me in what way I failed. You confused yourself with the redeemability of the soul. By clinging to the concept of easy ascent, you were lost. The life of the soul of a living being does not start and end with its incarnation in man. Indeed, you were not entirely misguided in your pessimism. It is true that man's soul is already corrupted from perfection at birth, but you, along with your institution, failed to comprehend the consequences of that corruption. The nature of life and death is not such that one who dies unsaved will thereafter suffer the miseries of hell. Hell is merely a state of being. It is a state of being manifested. When under siege, for your understanding of the wickedness of man, you had nowhere to go. You were right that all that exists holds a type of wickedness within, but your understanding of the structure of life and death was wrong. The so-called innocent that dies shall come again to be just as it was at death. Man inherits the wickedness of ancestors to the extent he is influenced by them. He is not born a clean slate, for nothing that lives is clean, or it would not live. Your constructs to describe the nature of these matters were inadequate. In linking yourself to that corrupted tradition, you became tied to a structure that contained you. It disallowed the freedom of thought necessary to properly formulate narratives to describe your colleagues' concepts that you yourself had known. It is by influence that darkness passes. Thus it is that you are wrong to teach that teachers may be wicked and yet pass on truth. Darkness may only pass where it is given leave to pass, and where influence lies, there shall darkness pass. It shall pass to the measure that darkness exists within the influencer and to the extent of his influence. The same is true for the passage of light. To the extent that your teachers were dark, they passed dark. It is impossible for light to pass unlost through a filter. At death, it is not that some are saved and others not. Again, here you are limited by the shortcomings of your constructs. A man's destiny after death is a result of his actions in life. There is no escape from good deeds on the assumption that man may be lost despite them. This is not a matter of black and white, though black and white exist. Man will fall to the extent he acts in darkness, and will rise to the extent he acts in lightness. But just as this does not mean a descent into hell due to a lack of perfection, so too it means that no matter how piously a man lived, there remains far for his soul to go. There is no security of the kind you sought. Those who die in a state of grace only die in a state of relative grace, and later may fall further again than they ever rose. Because you held that teachers may be impure, and yet still act as teachers of the pure, you helped lay the foundation for great injustice to be done. The result of this belief was a belief your institution could act as God on earth, and would be redeemed of its actions because of its intent. You gave license for iniquity, for persecution without measure, not just at the level of a single man, but for an entire institution. Much misery was brought about by this misguided rationalization of action. Just as your institution's priorities were corrupted, so were all of its actions. Inevitably, as your institution gained power and influence, so too did the measure of the iniquity it practiced. Man must always strive, and when spirit disperses from body, immediately to be embodied again, the new forms must also strive. Energy shall always be embodied in its single relevant form, better or worse, depending on its past. But that past shall mean nothing, other than in the sense of accomplishment and extrication from attachment to embodiment itself. But know that this is not to say the soul should ignore its surrounding. In fact, it must use it as a step by which to rise. To do this, it must have knowledge of that embodiment, as well as a belief in what it cannot see, that which is always better. You saw this, but did not comprehend the extension beyond the doctrine of the tradition in which you lived. This action of the soul must be according to its own exercise of will towards betterment. That exercise is what draws spirit towards what it sees, its eventual unity with the greater spirit of the universe. This is not a matter of being predestined to be saved from the misery of man's existence. Such is a falsehood of your tradition. Each is as he is, and each becomes what he causes himself to become. That fate is foreseen is irrelevant to man. He must still work for his fate. Life is not that of the damned and the saved. All are damned, and all may be saved, but by their own action, never through the action of another. Man must choose his fate, and you chose yours, and as a result, you are where you are now. His head low before the traveller, the man spoke. But then that would mean that you have not been sent to save, as was that forebear of your wife. The traveller responded with patience. I have not. I have been sent to remove that which has worked to impede man's ability to save himself. I cannot save, I can only free. Likewise, my wife's forebear could not save. That notion was a construct of your tradition. He was sent to teach, to remind man of God's law, so that man could save himself. You must understand I do not work against any man, I merely work against a disease within man. When a man is weak with illness, his own body may heal itself. But where that illness is life-threatening, he must take medicine that his body may have the chance to heal itself. I am the medicine, my father is the physician. He has determined this disease has had its time. Now its contagion is more than he can allow, and so I have come to destroy it. The man's particular confidence reasserted itself, still looking for a degree of reassurance in light of its failures. But as you have now come to be administered, many shall not survive the course of medicine. Does that not prove the truth of the position I took, that some shall be saved and only God knows which? The traveller spoke. The earth and mankind are not alone in the spheres of sentience. That which shall not live on here shall live on elsewhere, in what form is most appropriate. From the perspective of man, whether he lives or dies is a matter of his free choice. For my father it is not, it is a matter of inevitability. None shall be saved, for none shall receive anything other than that for which they have worked. You stand amongst men who are more wise than yourself, and some of those were wiser than others. But each of you served your purpose in the eyes of my father. Had you not shown your weakness, you would not have secured your position in an institution that would anyway have gained its power. Thus, your weakness saved from obscurity that part of you that was most important. You, based in your failures, were respected in that corrupted institution, and thus, when the time came, your name itself held an authority. And because your name, through your past, was tied to others more important, it meant that they could later be revived. It was in that way you served my father, and for that reason alone that you are here now. Torrin had never heard so much from her husband's voice. She was accustomed to hearing few words from him. Even when he had spoken at length, such as in the orchard, when he had told her the story of his life, his words had been pared down to abstract simplicity. To this man he spoke with cold confidence on a matter of apparent complexity and importance. She recognized much of what he said, perhaps from books she had read many years before, or perhaps from her own intuition. But what he spoke of was not something of which she had often thought. Her thought had always remained closer to her experience, localized in the grass around her, in the lines of her mother's face, the sound of her voice, the warmth of her horse's body. The man realized the traveller would say no more, and so he turned and walked to rejoin the ark. The figure to his left stepped forward and approached.